Sable had been running, not from danger, not from fear. She had been running toward the only person in the world she wanted to tell first. Her boots struck the stone corridors in quick, breathless beats as she climbed the east staircase 2 steps at a time, one hand pressed flat against her stomach and the other gripping the railing to keep herself steady. Her lungs burned. Her pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. But she was smiling. She was smiling so wide her cheeks ached because this morning the healer in the lower quarter had confirmed what she had suspected for 3 weeks. She was carrying his child. The Alpha King's child. The words still did not feel real. She whispered them under her breath as she climbed, testing the shape of them against her tongue. And every time a fresh wave of warmth flooded through her chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He would want to know. He had to want to know. They had never spoken about children. They had never even spoken about what they were to each other. Not out loud, not where the words could be held against them. But Sable had felt the way Theron held her in the dark. She had memorized the way his thumb traced slow circles on her hip when he thought she was sleeping. She had pressed her ear to his bare chest in the silence of his chambers and counted his heartbeats like coins, hoarding every one. He needed her. She was certain of it, and now she was carrying proof. The great hall doors stood open at the top of the corridor. That was the first wrong thing. The doors were never open during private sessions. Sound poured out into the hallway. Cheering. Laughter. The bright ring of goblets striking together in celebration. Sable slowed. She had expected to find him alone in his study, or at most with Draven, his beta, going over border reports the way they always did in the evenings. Not this. Not a crowd. She reached the threshold and stopped. The hall was full. Every seat taken, every torch lit, the long tables gleaming with wine and silver. The entire court was on its feet, faces flushed with drink and excitement, applauding something she had not yet seen. Then she saw it. Theron stood at the head of the hall, tall and broad and devastating in the way that had stopped her heart the very first time she laid eyes on him. The firelight carved sharp shadows beneath his cheekbones and caught the dark sweep of his hair where it fell across his forehead. He looked like a king. He looked like a weapon. And his hands, the hands she knew so well, the hands that had mapped her skin in the dark and tangled in her hair and pulled her close like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world, were resting on someone else's. Lysara Blackmere stood beside him in midnight silk, her pale fingers laced through his, her chin lifted with the quiet triumph of a woman who had already won. Draven's voice rang across the hall, formal and absolute. The king has chosen. A union between the crown and the Blackmere line. Let the northern and southern territories be joined. Strength bound to strength. Let no wolf challenge this bond. The court erupted. Sable stood in the doorway and felt the ground dissolve beneath her feet. Her hand slid from her stomach. She stared at him across the length of the hall, across the impossible distance between a king and a nobody scribe who had been foolish enough to believe that what happened in the dark meant something in the light. He had not seen her. His gaze was fixed forward, his jaw set in that rigid line she knew meant he was performing, playing the role. Wearing the crown the way he wore armor, heavy and deliberate, and designed to keep everything soft buried deep where no one could reach it. But he had chosen. That was the part that mattered. Whatever his reasons, whatever pressure or politics or cold calculation had led him here, he had taken another woman's hand in front of his entire kingdom. And Sable was standing in the doorway holding a secret that no longer had a home. The pain arrived late, the way it always does when the wound is deep enough. It started in her chest, a crack, quiet at first, then spreading outward through her ribs like ice fracturing across a frozen lake. She could not breathe. She could not think. The world had narrowed to the sight of his fingers wrapped around Lysara's and the sound of strangers cheering for a future that had just erased her from it. But Sable did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a luxury afforded to people who had someone to wipe them away. She had been left on the steps of a healer's clinic as an infant, raised by whoever had room, passed from household to household like a piece of furniture that no one quite wanted but no one could justify throwing out. She had learned to swallow grief the way other people swallowed water, quickly, privately, without making a mess. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She straightened her spine, she lifted her chin, and she smiled. It was not a bitter smile or a broken one. It was the kind of smile that costs everything you have left, the kind that looks real enough to fool anyone who is not paying close enough attention. And no one in that hall was paying attention to the scribe in the doorway with her hand falling away from a stomach that held a king's secret. Sable turned. She walked away. Her steps were steady and measured and perfectly calm, and she did not look back, not once. Not even when the cheering swelled behind her and the doors of the great hall swung shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing. She made it to her quarters before her hands started shaking. The room was small. A narrow bed, a writing desk stacked with the court records she had been transcribing for 2 years, a wooden chest that held everything she owned. It took her less than 10 minutes to pack. She folded her clothes with steady hands. She placed her mother's ring at the bottom of the bag where it would not get scratched. She left her scribe's seal on the desk because it belonged to the crown, and she no longer belonged here. The last thing she did was press her palm flat against her stomach one final time. The baby was barely there, a whisper of life, a flutter too faint to feel but too real to deny. "Just you and me," she murmured. "That is enough. That will always be enough." She slipped out through the servants' corridor before the celebration ended. The guards at the lower gate did not even look up. Why would they? She was no one. She had always been no one. The night swallowed her whole. She walked into the dark with her bag over her shoulder and his child beneath her heart, and she did not look back. Behind her, the castle blazed with torchlight and music and the sound of a kingdom celebrating its future. No one noticed she was gone. 3 weeks passed before anyone said her name. Theron sat at the head of the council table with a stack of territorial reports in front of him and a headache that had not left since the morning after the announcement. The candles burned low. Advisors droned. Lasara sat 2 seats to his left, elegant and composed and watching him with the careful attention of a woman still learning the shape of her new position. He had not touched her. Not once since the announcement. She had moved into the chambers adjoining his, had taken meals at his table, had smiled for the court, and played the role of the king's chosen with flawless precision. But the door between their rooms remained shut every night, and she did not ask why. Something was wrong with him. He could not name it, could not pin it down to a single source or symptom. It was a restlessness that lived beneath his skin, an itch he could not scratch, a low hum of wrongness that colored everything gray. His food tasted like nothing. His sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and fractured, never lasting more than an hour before he woke reaching for something beside him that was not there. His patience, never his strongest quality, had eroded to a razor's edge. He had snapped at 3 advisors this week alone, had growled at a servant who opened the door to his study too quickly and sent the poor woman stumbling backward with a tray of water glasses rattling in her grip, had paced the length of his chambers so many times at midnight that his boots had worn a visible path into the rug. And then there were the moments he told no one about. The way he caught himself inhaling deeply in the archive corridor, searching for a scent that was no longer there. The way his chest tightened every time he passed the small desk in the eastern gallery where a certain scribe used to sit hunched over border ledgers with ink stains on her fingers and her lower lip caught between her teeth in concentration. The way he had stopped in the doorway one morning and stared at that empty chair for so long that a passing guard had asked if he was feeling unwell. He had stood in his chambers at midnight staring at the corner near the window where a writing desk used to sit, though he could not remember whose desk it had been or why its absence carved a hole in the air. That was a lie. He remembered. He remembered everything. Draven. The word came out sharper than he intended. His beta looked up from the map he was studying, one eyebrow raised. "The scribe," Theron said carefully. "The one who handled the eastern border records. Where has she been reassigned?" Draven's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Sable Ashwood," he said. "She was not reassigned. She resigned." The name landed like a fist to the sternum. Theron kept his face neutral. "When?" "The night of your announcement, actually." Draven paused. 3 weeks ago." Theron's pen stopped moving. He stared at the report in front of him, but the words had blurred into meaningless shapes. 3 weeks. She had been gone for 3 weeks, and he had not been told. Had not asked. Had buried the thought of her so deep he had almost convinced himself she did not matter. Almost. Where did she go? No one knows. Draven leaned back in his chair. She left no forwarding address, took her things from her quarters and simply vanished. No family on record, no pack affiliation outside the Crown's household. She covered her tracks thoroughly. He paused. It was clean, Theron. Deliberate. She did not leave in a panic. She left like someone who had already made peace with never coming back. Something dark and sharp twisted in Theron's chest. He set the pen down slowly, precisely, because his hand had begun to tremble, and that was not something a king could afford to let anyone see. I see, he said. Draven watched him for a long moment. Would you like me to make inquiries? No. The word came out too fast. Theron corrected himself, forcing his voice into something measured and indifferent. No. If she chose to leave, that is her right. Draven said nothing, but his silence had a quality to it, heavy and deliberate, that suggested he was choosing not to say a great many things. The council session ended. The advisors filed out. Lysara lingered, rising from her seat with the fluid grace that seemed built into every movement she made. She touched his arm as he stood, a light, careful gesture. Dinner tonight? She asked. Her voice was pleasant and warm and utterly wrong. It was the wrong pitch, the wrong cadence. It carried none of the quiet humor that used to greet him in the archive at midnight, none of the warmth that made him forget, even for a moment, that he was carrying a kingdom on his back. I have work, Theron said without looking at her. Something flickered across Lysara's face. Not hurt, exactly. She was too controlled for that, but awareness. The quiet, growing recognition of a woman who was beginning to understand that she had been chosen by a man who was in love with someone else. She withdrew her hand without a word and left the chamber. Theron watched her go and felt nothing at all. That absence of feeling frightened him more than the alternative. He left the chamber and walked to his rooms alone. The corridor was empty. His footsteps echoed against stone, and the sound felt too loud, too solitary, like the hallways themselves were reminding him how alone he was. That night, it happened for the first time. He was standing at the window, staring out at the dark tree line beyond the castle walls, when his wolf surged forward without warning. There was no trigger, no threat, no reason. One moment he was himself, and the next his vision sharpened, his bones shifted, and a snarl ripped from his throat that shook the glass in the window frame. He caught himself, barely. His claws had extended, puncturing the stone windowsill. His teeth had lengthened. His spine was curved at an angle that was neither fully human nor fully wolf, and the pain of the incomplete shift sent white fire through every nerve. He forced the wolf back. It took everything he had, every ounce of control he had spent a lifetime building, every wall he had erected between his human mind and the beast that shared his body. His hands were bleeding where the claws had torn through, and his breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. He sank to his knees on the cold stone floor and pressed his forehead against the wall. His wolf was howling inside him, not with rage, not with the battle fury he had felt 100 times in war, the controlled, channeled violence that made him deadly on a battlefield. This was different. This was raw and aimless and bottomless. It was howling with grief. It was howling for something lost, something taken, something his wolf understood that his human mind refused to accept. And beneath the howling, threaded through it like a scent he could not escape, was a name. Sable. Theron closed his eyes and pressed his bleeding hands flat against the floor and told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he had made the right choice. He told himself that what he felt was guilt, and guilt could be survived. He told himself all of this, and his wolf screamed louder. By morning, the claw marks in the windowsill were deep enough to fit a finger inside. He covered them with a stack of books and said nothing. But when he caught his reflection in the mirror as he dressed, the face that stared back at him was hollow and haunted, and barely recognizable as his own. He looked, he realized with a sickening lurch, exactly like his father had in those final months. He turned away from the mirror and did not look at it again. The village of Ashwick sat at the southern edge of the Greymere Valley, so far from the capital that most of its residents had never seen the castle, let alone its king. It was a small place. A handful of stone cottages clustered around a market square, a river that ran clear and cold from the mountains, a single inn that served as tavern, post office, and gathering hall. Sable arrived with dust on her boots and shadows beneath her eyes, and told the innkeeper she was looking for work, any work. She did not mention where she had come from. She did not mention the castle, or the king, or the child she carried. She said her name was Sable, that she could read and write and keep accounts, and that she needed a room. The innkeeper directed her to Odessa. Odessa Thorne was the village healer, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and hands that smelled perpetually of dried rosemary and wood smoke. She lived in a cottage at the edge of the village with a garden that sprawled in every direction and a reputation for taking in strays. "Can you grind herbs without complaining about your hands?" Odessa asked, looking Sable up and down with sharp, assessing eyes. "Yes." "Can you wake before dawn and not need to be told what to do?" "Yes." "Can you keep your mouth shut about things that are not your business?" Sable almost smiled. "That is the one thing I am best at." Odessa studied her for a moment longer, then stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Rooms in the back. Breakfast is at first light. I do not tolerate self-pity, and I do not ask questions unless I need to." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to Sable in weeks. She settled into Ashwick the way water settles into cracks, quietly, completely. She rose before dawn and ground herbs at Odessa's workbench. She organized the healer's stores, which had devolved into a state of creative chaos over the years. She helped in the garden, learned the names of plants she had only ever read about in books, and discovered that her hands, trained for years to hold a pen, were surprisingly good at more delicate work. The days were long and full and mercifully exhausting. By evening, she was tired enough to sleep without thinking, and that was the closest thing to peace she could manage. But the nights were harder. She lay in her narrow bed in the back room with the window cracked to let in the mountain air, and she pressed her hand to her stomach, and she talked to the baby. "You will be so loved," she whispered into the dark. "I will make sure of it. You will never wonder if you are enough. You will never have to earn your place." The words caught in her throat because she was making promises she was not sure she could keep. She was alone, truly alone. No pack, no mate, no family. Just a woman in a borrowed room with a secret growing inside her. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, restless and uneasy. It had been doing that more and more since she left the castle, pacing inside her like a caged thing, pressing against her ribs as if trying to get out, or trying to get back to something, to someone. She could feel him sometimes, not clearly, not the way the old stories described a completed bond, but in flickers and fragments, a sudden surge of anger that was not hers, a wave of exhaustion at odd hours, a hollow, aching loneliness that hit her in the middle of grinding chamomile and nearly brought her to her knees. She told herself it was her imagination. She told herself grief played tricks on the mind. Sable shut her eyes and forced the thought down. She would not think about him. She would not wonder if he had noticed she was gone. She would not replay the image of his hands on another woman's and search for some sign that he had been forced into it, that he had not wanted it, that she had mattered. She would not. She would not. Her wolf whimpered, and Sable pressed her face into the pillow and did not cry. Far away, in a castle she would never return to, Theron was on his knees. Draven found him in the armory at midnight, half-shifted and panting, his claws buried in the wooden training post. The post was destroyed. Deep gouges ran from top to bottom, and splinters covered the floor like fallen snow. The king's shirt was torn. His eyes were wrong. Not fully human, not fully wolf. Something caught between, something fighting itself. Theron. Draven kept his voice calm and his distance respectful. An alpha in an uncontrolled shift was not something you approached carelessly, even if that alpha was your oldest friend. The king's head snapped toward him. A snarl rumbled through his chest, low and vibrating and utterly feral. Then recognition flickered in those strange, split-pupil eyes, and the snarl died. Theron's shoulders dropped. The claws retracted slowly, painfully, and he pressed his bleeding hands against his thighs. "How long?" Draven asked quietly. "It is getting worse." Theron's voice was rough, scraped raw. "Every night, the wolf comes and I cannot hold it." Draven crouched beside him. This started when she left. It was not a question. Theron flinched like he had been struck. "Find her," the king said. And there was something in his voice that Draven had never heard before, something desperate and broken and barely held together. I need you to find her, Draven. Why? Draven asked. Not to be cruel, to make him say it. Theron met his eyes. Because I think I am losing my wolf, and I think she is the reason. Draven nodded slowly. I have already started looking. In the quiet village of Ashwick, 4 days later, Odessa set down a cup of tea and looked across the table at Sable with an expression that was too careful to be casual. How far along are you? She asked. Sable's hand froze around her own cup. I do not know what you mean, child. Odessa's voice was gentle but immovable. I have been a healer for 30 years. I knew before you walked through my door. The way you hold your stomach when you think no one is looking. The way you go pale every morning and pretend it is the mountain air. Sable set the cup down. Her hands were shaking. About 7 weeks, she said quietly. And the father? Does not know. Does not know or was not told. The distinction cut deeper than Sable expected. She pressed her lips together and stared at the table. He made his choice, she said. I made mine. Odessa watched her for a long moment, then reached across the table and took Sable's hand. All right. Then we take care of you and this little one. That is what matters now. For the first time since she had left the castle, Sable felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. Not gone, not healed, but loosened, like a fist slowly unclenching. That night, Odessa insisted on a proper examination. Sable lay on the narrow cot in the healer's workroom, staring at the ceiling while Odessa's hands moved across her stomach with practiced steadiness. The healer was quiet for a long time, too long. Then Odessa's hands went still. Sable looked at her. The healer's face had changed. Something in her expression had shifted from professional calm to something sharper, something almost like alarm. Child, Odessa said slowly, who is the father of this baby? Sable's heart began to hammer. Why? What is wrong? Odessa straightened up. Her eyes were wide and serious and fixed on Sable's with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. The signature this child carries. The energy, the aura, whatever you want to call it. She paused. This is not an ordinary wolf. This child is of royal blood, ancient royal blood. And whatever is growing inside you is already stronger than anything I have felt in 30 years of practice. Sable stared at her, and the carefully constructed walls she had been building for the past month began to crack. The silence in Odessa's workroom lasted a very long time. Sable sat up slowly, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders like armor. The candle on the shelf behind them guttered and swayed, throwing long shadows across the walls. Odessa stood with her hands still raised slightly, as though she had touched something dangerous and was not yet sure whether it would bite. Tell me, Odessa said quietly. Tell me everything. And Sable did. She told her about the castle, about the 2 years she had spent as a court scribe, invisible and efficient, buried in documents and border ledgers while the world of nobles and wolves and politics moved around her like a river around a stone. She told her about the night King Theron had found her working late in the archive, how he had paused in the doorway and watched her for a full minute before she noticed him, how she had knocked an entire stack of records off the desk when she saw him and spent the next 30 seconds trying to pick them up while apologizing so profusely that he had actually laughed. She told Odessa about the conversations that followed, late nights in the archive that stretched longer and longer, the way he started coming back, not for documents but for her, the way his voice changed when they were alone, dropping from the clipped authority of a king to something quieter and rougher and painfully honest. She told her about the first time he kissed her, against the archive shelves, surrounded by the smell of old paper and leather, his hands shaking, which had shocked her because this was a man who had won wars, and his hands shook when he touched her face. She told her about the months that followed, secret meetings, locked doors, his chambers at midnight, her leaving before dawn, the constant, exhausting performance of pretending in daylight that she meant nothing to him and he meant nothing to her. He never claimed me publicly, Sable said. Her voice was steady but thin. I understood why. A scribe with no family, no pact ties, no bloodline worth mentioning. The council would have revolted. And you accepted that? Odessa asked. I told myself it did not matter, that what we had in private was enough. Sable's mouth twisted. I was very good at lying to myself. She told Odessa about Lysara, the daughter of the northern pack leader, beautiful and powerful and everything a king was expected to choose. She had arrived at court 6 weeks before the announcement, and Sable had watched the political machinery begin to move with the slow inevitability of a millstone grinding grain. I saw the council meetings, Sable said. I transcribed the records. The alliance with the Blackmere Pack would secure the northern border. It would end 50 years of territorial disputes. Thousands of wolves would benefit. She paused, and her hands tightened in the blanket. I understood the logic. I understood why he had to choose her. Her voice cracked, just barely. I just did not expect it to feel like dying. She told Odessa about the night of the announcement. The open doors, the cheering, the sight of his hands on Lysara's, the smile, the walk away, the bag packed in 10 minutes, the dark road stretching into nothing. When she finished, the candle had burned down to a stub and Odessa's tea had gone cold. You love him, Odessa said. Sable did not deny it. There was no point. The truth sat between them, too heavy to lift and too obvious to hide. And he loves you, Odessa added. He chose someone else. Those are not always contradictory things, child. Odessa leaned forward. A man can love a woman and still be a fool, especially a powerful man who is terrified of the things he cannot control. Sable shook her head. It does not matter. I will not go back. I will not beg to be chosen. Odessa studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but there is something you need to understand about what is happening inside you. She pointed to Sable's stomach. That child is not just carrying royal blood, it is carrying a bond signature. Sable frowned. A what? When a wolf recognizes its true mate, the bond begins to form whether either party accepts it or not. If the bond is completed through claiming, it becomes permanent. But if the bond is denied, Odessa paused, choosing her words carefully. The incomplete connection begins to collapse, and it does not collapse quietly. Sable's blood went cold. What do you mean? The bond fights to complete itself. Restlessness, pain. In extreme cases, the wolf spirit itself begins to fracture, to separate from the human. When that happens, neither survives. Sable pressed her hand against her chest, where the ache had lived since the night she walked away. And the pregnancy? Is accelerating it. The child is creating a bridge between your wolf and his, strengthening a connection that was never meant to be left unfinished. If you stay separated, the bond will tear you apart, both of you. Sable closed her eyes. He does not know about the baby. I gathered that. And I cannot go back. Her voice hardened. You do not understand, Odessa. He stood in front of his entire kingdom and chose another woman. He looked at the future, and I was not in it. I understand perfectly, Odessa said. You are protecting yourself. You have been protecting yourself your entire life because no one else ever did. But protection is not the same as survival, child. And right now, you are not just deciding for yourself. Her gaze dropped to Sable's stomach. Sable placed both hands over the small, barely visible curve and felt the flutter of something impossibly tender beneath her palms. In the castle, 500 miles north, an old healer named Fenwick stood before the Alpha King and delivered a verdict that emptied the room of air. Your wolf is rejecting you, Fenwick said. His voice was dry and clinical and utterly without comfort. The separation has already begun. Theron sat rigid in his chair. Draven stood behind him, his face carved from stone. I have seen this before, Fenwick continued. Once, 40 years ago, an alpha in the Eastern Territories denied his true mate to marry for alliance. Within 2 months, his wolf began to fracture. Within 4, the separation was complete. He paused. He did not survive. The silence that followed was absolute. You have recognized a true mate, Fenwick said, watching Theron with eyes that had seen too much to offer false hope. Your wolf has bonded, even if you have not. And by choosing another, you have set the bond at war with itself. The wolf will continue to separate from you, fighting to reach its mate, and you will continue to lose control of your shifts until there is nothing left to hold together. How long? Draven asked. 3 months. Perhaps 4, given his strength. Theron had not spoken. He sat with his hands flat on the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, his jaw locked. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Sable. Her name fell from his mouth like a prayer offered too late. Draven stepped forward. We will find her. Theron shook his head slowly. I sent her away. I did not just choose someone else, Draven. I chose someone else in front of every wolf in this kingdom. I took another woman's hand while Sable. He stopped, swallowed. While Sable was somewhere in that castle, carrying a piece of my life that I did not even know about. Draven went still. What do you mean, carrying a piece of your life? Theron looked at him, and the anguish in his face was so raw it made Draven take a step back. I felt it, through the bond. Before it started breaking apart, I felt something. A presence. Faint, like a heartbeat beneath water. His voice dropped to a whisper. I think she was pregnant, Draven. I think she was pregnant when she left. The beta closed his eyes. When he opened them, his expression had hardened into something fierce and resolute. Then we do not just find her, we bring her home. But Theron's face held something deeper than guilt. Something older and more corrosive. My father destroyed himself over a mate bond, he said quietly. When my mother died, the bond shattered him. He stopped eating, stopped leading, stopped seeing me. The kingdom nearly fell because its alpha chose grief over everything. His voice was rough and low and thick with something that sounded like shame. I swore I would never let that happen. I swore I would never need anyone that way. He met Draven's eyes. And then Sable happened. And needing her terrified me more than any war ever has. So I chose the safe option. I chose the woman who could not destroy me. The confession hung in the air between them, ugly and honest. Draven was quiet for a moment. Then he said, So you destroyed yourself instead. Theron did not answer. He did not have to. In Ashwick, 500 miles from the man whose wolf was tearing itself apart to reach her, Sable woke gasping in the dark. The pain hit her like a wall. Sharp, blinding, centered in her chest where the ache had lived for weeks but suddenly amplified 100-fold. She doubled over in her narrow bed, her hands clutching at her ribs, and bit down on a scream. Then the baby kicked. It was the first time. A flutter, barely a whisper of movement, but it sent a shockwave through Sable's body that had nothing to do with the physical sensation, because with the kick came something else. A vision, not a dream. Something sharper and more immediate, as though a window had been torn open between her world and his. She saw Theron. He was on his knees in a dark room, half shifted, his spine arched at an angle that should have been impossible. His claws were buried in the stone floor. His wolf was trying to tear free from his body, and the agony on his face was so profound that Sable felt it in her own bones, in her own blood, echoing through a connection she had tried so desperately to sever. The vision lasted 3 seconds. It left her shaking, drenched in sweat, with tears streaming down her face. And she understood, with a clarity that cut through every wall she had built, that walking away had not saved her. It had not saved him. It had not protected anyone. It was killing them both. 6 weeks had passed since Fenwick delivered his verdict, and the clock was running down. Lysara found him in the war room at dawn. He had not slept. The maps spread across the table were covered in his handwriting, routes traced and retraced, villages circled and crossed out, a desperate cartography of loss that spread across the southern territories like a web. His eyes were bloodshot. His shirt was torn at the collar where the last shift had caught him mid-dressing, and there were fresh scratches along his forearms where his own claws had broken through. He looked up when she entered and saw, in the pale morning light, that she already knew. How long? Lysara asked. Her voice was steady, controlled, beautiful in its precision. She had always been beautiful. That had never been the problem. Lysara, he rose from the chair, and the movement cost him. His body was failing. The separation between wolf and man had progressed to the point where standing too quickly made the world tilt and blur. I owe you an explanation. You owe me a great deal more than that. She crossed her arms, and the gesture was more shield than anger. But an explanation will do for now. He told her. Not everything. Not the details of what he and Sable had been, but enough. The bond, the fracture, the healer's prognosis. 3 months. perhaps 4. The fact that he had known, somewhere beneath the politics and the fear, that choosing Lasara was choosing death in slow motion. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the silence that followed was not heavy or wounded, it was clean. You knew, she said. Before the announcement, you knew she was your mate. Yes. And you chose me anyway. Yes. Something shifted in her face then. Not heartbreak. Lasara Blackmere was too proud for that. What crossed her features was something closer to clarity. The sharp, cold recognition of a woman who finally understood why the man beside her had never once looked at her the way a mate should. Then you are a fool, she said, and I am a fool for not seeing it sooner. She turned toward the door, then stopped. I will speak to my father. The alliance can be restructured without a mating union. It will cost you politically. The council will be furious. I know. And the northern territories will demand concessions. Whatever they want. She looked at him over her shoulder, and for the first time, there was something almost gentle in her expression. Find her, Theron, before it is too late for both of you. She left. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt like the end of one story and the uncertain beginning of another. By afternoon, the castle knew. By evening, the council was in an uproar. Advisors who had spent months negotiating the Blackmere alliance stormed into his chambers, demanding explanations he did not have the energy to give. Theron sat through their fury with the patience of a man who had already accepted that nothing they could say was worse than what he had done to himself. When the last advisor left, Draven stepped in. The scouts have narrowed the search, the beta said. Southern Greymere Valley, a village called Ashwick. Theron's head came up. His wolf surged, sudden and violent, pressing against his ribs with a force that nearly doubled him over. For the first time in weeks, the wolf was not howling with grief. It was pulling. Toward her. How far? Theron managed through clenched teeth. 5 days' ride. 3 if you push hard. Theron stood. The room swayed. He gripped the edge of the table and waited for the floor to settle beneath him. I am not sure you can survive the journey, Draven said quietly. The shifts are coming closer together. If one hits you on the road, then I will deal with it on the road. Theron. She is carrying my child, Draven. His voice cracked on the word child, splitting open like a wound that had never properly closed. She is carrying my child in some village 500 miles from here, and she is there because I put her there, because I was too much of a coward to choose her when it mattered. Draven studied him. Then we leave at first light. They left before first light. Theron rode like a man possessed, which, in a sense, he was. His wolf drove him south with a single-minded ferocity that overrode exhaustion and pain, and the terrifying episodes where his body tried to split itself in two. Draven rode beside him, steady and watchful, catching him twice when the shifts hit without warning and nearly sent him tumbling from the saddle. On the second night, camped in a clearing off the southern road, Theron woke screaming. The shift came on so violently that his spine cracked and reshaped before he was fully conscious. Draven pinned him down, hands on his shoulders, weight across his chest, talking him back from the edge with a calm, relentless voice that cut through the wolf's frenzy like a blade through fog. When it passed, Theron lay gasping in the dirt, his torn shirt hanging off one shoulder, his fingernails caked with soil where the claws had extended and dragged through the earth. We should rest, Draven said. We keep moving. You cannot help her if you are dead before you arrive. I am already dead without her. The words came out before he could stop them, raw and honest and so stripped of pretense that Draven had no response at all. They rode on. The miles blurred. The landscape changed from northern forest to open farmland, to the rolling green of the southern valleys. Theron's body held together through sheer stubbornness, and the bond pulled him south like a thread attached to his sternum, growing stronger and more insistent with every mile. On the third morning, they crested a ridge, and the Greymere Valley spread below them like a painting, green and gold and quilted with farmland, the river threading through its center like a silver vein. And there, nestled at the valley's southern edge, a cluster of stone cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys. Ashwick. Theron dismounted. His legs nearly buckled beneath him, and Draven caught his arm. Let me go first, the beta said. No. He walked into the village alone. The morning was cool and still, dew clinging to the grass, the air smelling of wood smoke and wild sage. Villagers glanced at him as he passed, a tall, gaunt stranger with shadows carved beneath his eyes and hands that trembled at his sides. None of them recognized their king. He barely recognized himself. He had lost weight. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had been formidable just months ago, and he walked with the careful, measured steps of a man conserving what little strength remained. He found the cottage at the edge of the village, the way a compass finds north. The bond pulled him to it with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely. His wolf was shaking inside him, pressing forward, desperate, frantic, alive in a way it had not been in months. The garden was overgrown and fragrant. Herbs spilled over the low stone wall in cascades of green and purple, and through the window of the cottage, framed by morning light, he saw her. Sable stood at a workbench, grinding something in a mortar. Her hair was longer than he remembered, pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She looked thinner, tired. There were shadows beneath her eyes that mirrored his own. And she was unmistakably, beautifully, heartbreakingly pregnant. The sight of her, of the swell of her stomach beneath the loose linen shirt, of the way her free hand rested unconsciously on the curve of their child, hit Theron like a physical blow. His knees gave out. He caught himself on the garden wall, his fingers digging into the stone, and the sound that escaped his throat was not human. She looked up. Their eyes met through the window. The mortar slipped from her hand and hit the bench with a dull thud. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The bond between them screamed, a sound only they could hear, raw and desperate and deafening. Then Sable straightened. She wiped her hands on her apron with careful, deliberate movements. She walked to the cottage door and opened it. She stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, and looked at the king of the realm kneeling in her garden with tears running down his face. "You are not welcome here, Theron," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, absolutely devastating. He did not move. He did not argue. He did not beg, though every cell in his body was screaming at him to cross the distance between them and take her in his arms, and never let go. Instead, he sat down on the cold, damp ground outside her door. He leaned his back against the garden wall, tipped his head back, and closed his eyes. "Then I will wait," he said. He waited. It rained that first night. Not a gentle rain, but a steady, soaking downpour that turned the garden path to mud and drummed against the cottage roof in relentless sheets. Sable stood at the window and watched the dark shape of him sitting against the garden wall, rain running down his face and plastering his hair to his skull, and she told herself she did not care. She told herself this for approximately 2 hours before Odessa appeared behind her in the doorway, with her arms crossed and her eyebrows raised. "There is an alpha king drowning in my garden," Odessa observed mildly. "He can leave whenever he wants. He does not appear to want to." Sable pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "That is not my problem." Odessa watched her for a long moment, then said nothing and went back to bed. Sable stayed at the window. She watched his silhouette in the rain, watched the rigid set of his shoulders and the way he did not move, not even to pull his coat tighter, not even when the wind shifted and drove the rain directly into his face. He just sat there, soaked and shivering, and waited. She hated him for it. She hated the way his stubbornness mirrored her own. She hated the fact that he was suffering and she could feel it through the bond, every tremor of cold and exhaustion echoing in her own body. She hated that her wolf was clawing at her chest, howling at her to go to him, and she hated that the baby had been kicking nonstop since the moment he arrived, as though their child already knew its father was near and was furious at the distance between them. She did not go to him. By morning, the rain had stopped. Sable stepped outside to find Theron exactly where she had left him, slumped against the wall with his eyes closed. He was shivering violently. His lips were pale. His breathing was shallow and wrong, with long pauses between each inhale that made her stomach clench with fear she refused to name. Odessa was already there, crouching beside him with a cup of tea and a blanket she was draping over his shoulders, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had treated worse fools in her time. "You look terrible," Odessa informed him. Theron opened his eyes. They found Sable immediately, as though she were the only point of reference in the world, and the raw, desperate longing in his gaze made her take a step backward. "Good morning," he said hoarsely. Sable did not respond. She stood on the cottage step with her arms wrapped around herself and looked at the man who had broken her heart, sitting in the mud of someone else's garden because she had told him he was not welcome inside. And despite everything, despite the anger and the hurt and the memory of his hands on another woman's, something inside her cracked at the sight of him. She pushed it down, hard. "We need to talk," she said. They sat at Odessa's kitchen table, the healer moving quietly in the background, present but unintrusive. Sable sat across from Theron with her hands wrapped around a cup she was not drinking from, and she told him everything. She told him about the night of the announcement, about running up the east staircase with her hand on her stomach and joy so fierce it frightened her, about the open doors, the cheering, the sight of Lasara's fingers laced through his. She told him about the smile, the one that cost everything, and the walk back to her quarters that felt like walking through water. "I packed in 10 minutes," she said, her voice flat and precise. "I left my scribe's seal on the desk because it belonged to the crown. I walked out through the servants' corridor, and the guards at the lower gate did not even look up because I was nobody. I have always been nobody. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of the great hall watching you hold another woman's hand, I felt every single time in my life that I was not chosen. Every family that took me in and then passed me along. Every time I was useful but never wanted." She paused. Her hands were white-knuckled around the cup, and I promised myself, right there, that I would never stand in a doorway again waiting for someone to notice me. Theron's face was ashen. Each word landed like a blow, and he absorbed every one without flinching, without defending himself, without looking away. "I was going to tell you about the baby," Sable continued. "That is why I was running. I had just come from the healer, and I was so happy, Theron. I was so stupidly, recklessly happy because I thought—" Her voice splintered. She pressed her lips together and waited until she could speak again. "I thought you would want to know. I thought what we had was real." "It was real," Theron said, and his voice was destroyed. "Sable, it was the most real thing in my life." "Then why?" The word came out louder than she intended, sharp and raw and vibrating with months of suppressed anguish. "Why did you take her hand? Why did you stand in front of your entire kingdom and choose someone you do not love? Why did you look at the future and decide I was not in it?" "Because I was afraid." "Of what? Of me? Of a scribe with no bloodline and ink-stained fingers? Of needing you." His fingers were white against the tabletop. "Of needing you so much that losing you would end me." He told her about his father then. The same story he had told Draven, but different now. More. The details he had never spoken aloud. The ones that lived in the dark parts of his memory like splinters that could not be removed. His mother's death. His father's collapse. The 9-year-old boy who watched his father, the Alpha King, stop eating, stop speaking, stop recognizing his own son. The way the kingdom crumbled around them while the man who was supposed to protect it stared at a wall and waited to die. "I brought him food," Theron said, and his voice had dropped to something barely audible. "Every morning. I would carry a tray to his room and set it on the table beside his bed, and I would say good morning, and he would not look at me. He would look through me, like I was made of glass, like I was already gone." Sable's hands had gone still on the cup. She was watching him with an expression he could not read. "The food was always untouched when I came back the next morning," Theron continued. "Every single day. I kept bringing it. I thought if I just kept showing up, if I was enough, he would come back. He would see me. He would choose to stay." His voice broke. "He chose her," Theron whispered. "Even in death, he chose her over me, over the kingdom, over everything." He swallowed hard. "And I swore I would never give anyone that power over me. I would never love someone so completely that losing them would make me abandon everything else." He looked at her across the table, and his eyes were wet. "And then you happened. And every morning I woke up beside you, I felt that same pull, that same terrifying depth, and I knew that if I let myself fall completely, I would never survive losing you." "So you lost me on purpose," Sable said. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes," he admitted, "and it was the worst mistake of my life." Sable stared at him. The anger was still there, molten and justified, but beneath it was a grief that matched his own, because she understood now. She understood the shape of his fear, the terrible logic of it, even as it infuriated her. You chose fear over me, she said, her voice shaking. Over us, over your child. And I cannot forgive that just because you regret it now. Regret is not the same as change. Words are not the same as choosing differently. I know, he said. Do you? Because I need you to understand something, Theron. She leaned forward, and her eyes were fierce despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. I did not leave because you hurt me. I left because I will not teach my child that love means waiting to be chosen. I will not teach them that their worth depends on someone else deciding they are enough. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Odessa stepped forward then, quietly but firmly. I need to interrupt, the healer said, because whatever you two decide about your relationship, there is a medical reality that cannot wait. She laid it out plainly. The bond, the fracture, the fact that Theron's wolf was separating and would kill him within months, the fact that Sable's own wolf was deteriorating from the broken connection, and the child, their child, who was caught in the middle of an incomplete bond that was tearing its parents apart. This baby is a bridge between your wolves, Odessa said. It is drawing power from both of you to sustain itself, and right now it is drawing from a broken circuit. The stress on the child will only increase as the pregnancy progresses. I am not being dramatic when I say this is life and death for all three of you. The room went silent. Sable's hand moved to her stomach instinctively, protectively. Theron watched the gesture, and the raw pain on his face deepened. The baby needs you both, Odessa said. Alive and close. Whatever you feel about each other, the bond requires proximity to stabilize. Without it, none of you will survive the winter. Sable looked at Theron across the table. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. You can stay, Sable said finally. Her voice was hard and careful, and offered nothing beyond the words themselves. For the baby. Not for you. Not for us. For the baby. Thank you, Theron said quietly. Do not thank me. And do not mistake this for forgiveness. He nodded. He did not argue. He did not push. That first week was agony in a different key. Theron slept on Odessa's floor, a thin blanket between him and the cold stone, and he did not complain. He woke before dawn and worked. He chopped wood until the pile beside the cottage was taller than Sable. He fixed the garden gate that had been hanging crooked for months. He carried water from the well without being asked, repaired the leak in the storeroom ceiling, and cleared the overgrown path to the river with a methodical, relentless focus that had nothing to do with the tasks themselves and everything to do with the fact that action was the only language he had left. He did not try to touch Sable, did not try to talk to her beyond what was necessary, did not stand too close or look too long. He kept his distance with a discipline that must have been excruciating, and Sable knew it was excruciating because she could feel his restraint through the bond, could feel the wolf inside him straining toward her with every breath. On the third day, he found her struggling with a delivery crate that had been left at the garden wall. She was trying to lift it, and the weight was wrong for her condition, and she knew it, but she had been doing things alone for months, and the habit of self-reliance was harder to break than pride. He appeared beside her without a word, did not ask permission, did not comment on the fact that she should not be lifting heavy things. He simply picked up the crate and carried it inside and set it on the workbench and left. She stared after him and felt something dangerous stir beneath her anger. On the fourth day, she came out of the cottage to find a small wooden bench built beside the garden door. It had not been there the night before. It was simple, sturdy, sanded, smooth, and positioned exactly where the afternoon sun fell warmest. She looked at Theron across the garden. He was splitting logs, his back to her, and he did not turn around. She sat on the bench and felt the warmth of the sun on her face and told herself the tightness in her throat was nothing. But proximity was doing its work. Within days, his shifts stabilized. The violent, uncontrolled episodes that had been ripping him apart grew less frequent, then stopped entirely. Color returned to his face. The hollows beneath his cheekbones began to fill. And Sable, though she would not have admitted it under threat of death, felt the change too. The ache in her chest loosened. The migraines receded. Her wolf, agitated and miserable for months, settled into something calmer. Not peaceful, not yet, but calmer. One night, she woke to a sound outside. Low, ragged breathing, a bitten-off groan. She rose from bed and walked to the back door and found Theron crouched in the garden, his hands pressed flat against the earth, his body rigid with the effort of holding back a shift. He had not made it to the floor. The wolf had come for him in his sleep and driven him outside, where there was space to break apart without destroying Odessa's cottage. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. His arms were shaking, and the sound he was making, the low, desperate keen of a wolf fighting its own body, was the loneliest thing Sable had ever heard. She should have gone back inside. She should have let Draven handle it. Draven, who had made camp at the edge of the village, who had been watching his king deteriorate for months. She should have protected herself the way she had been protecting herself for her entire life. Sable knelt beside him. His skin was burning hot, sheened with sweat, and his eyes when he looked at her were split between human gray and wolf gold. "I am fine," he ground out. "Go back inside." She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. The shift stopped. Instantly, like a flame snuffed between two fingers. The tension drained out of his body so completely that he nearly collapsed, catching himself on one hand, breathing hard. His wolf, which had been thrashing against his ribs like a caged animal, went quiet, not dormant, quiet, settled, as though it had finally found the thing it had been searching for. They looked at each other in the dark. The garden was quiet. The moon was out. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once and fell silent, and the bond between them hummed with a warmth that neither of them had the strength to deny. "Come inside," Sable said. "The floor is cold, but it is better than the rain." He slept on her floor that night. Not Odessa's floor, hers. The narrow room in the back of the cottage with the cracked window and the mountain air, and the bed where she whispered to their child every night before she slept. He lay on the cold stones with a folded blanket beneath his head, and did not make a sound. Sable lay in her bed above him, staring at the ceiling, intensely aware of his breathing, of the warmth of him filling the small room, of the bond between them pulsing with each exhale like a second heartbeat. She did not sleep for a very long time, but when she finally did, it was the deepest sleep she had managed in months. In the morning, she woke to the smell of tea. He had risen before her. There was a cup on the small table beside her bed, steaming and fragrant. Chamomile and honey, her preference, which she had never told him. He must have noticed. During all those months in the castle, all those nights in his chambers, he must have been paying attention to things she never realized he was cataloging. She picked up the cup and took a sip and hated how much it moved her. They developed a rhythm over the days that followed. Careful, guarded, like two people learning to walk across a frozen lake, testing each step before committing their weight. He chopped wood. She ground herbs. He ate meals at Odessa's table with quiet gratitude and never presumed to sit beside Sable unless she indicated the seat. She did not indicate it often, but when she did, something eased between them, infinitesimal but real. He did not ask about the baby. He did not ask to touch her stomach or feel the kicks or know whether it was a boy or a girl. He waited. Sable could feel the wanting through the bond, the desperate, barely contained need to be part of this. But he held it back with the same iron discipline he applied to everything, and she was grateful for it even as it broke her heart. On the fifth evening, she offered. They were sitting in the garden at dusk, the sky fading from gold to violet above the mountains. Sable was resting with her back against the cottage wall, her hands on her stomach, feeling the baby move in slow, rolling waves. "Do you want to feel?" she asked. He went still. She watched his throat work as he swallowed, watched the way his hands clenched and then deliberately unclenched in his lap. "Yes," he said roughly, "if you will allow it." She took his hand and placed it on the curve of her stomach. The baby kicked. Hard, as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment, as though it recognized its father's touch through layers of skin and muscle and the complicated mess of everything between them. Theron's face crumbled. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that, more devastating. The careful mask he had been wearing since he arrived simply dissolved. His lips pressed together. His jaw trembled. His eyes filled with tears that he did not try to hide. And he stared at his hand on her stomach with an expression of such naked wonder and grief and love that Sable had to look away. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry. For all of it." She did not respond, but she did not remove his hand. That night, they fell asleep in the same room, him on the floor, her in the bed, their breathing synchronized without either of them intending it. And the bond, strengthened by proximity and the small, hard-won gestures of the day, pulled them under. Sable opened her eyes to a place she had never seen before. It was not the dark, oppressive space of her earlier visions. This was something else entirely. A vast, open landscape, neither day nor night, the sky an endless gradient of amber and gray. The ground beneath her feet was soft, covered in pale grass that moved without wind. The air smelled of something ancient and clean, like rain on stone, like the first breath of morning. "Where are we?" she murmured. "The bond space." Theron's voice came from beside her. He was there, standing close, looking around with an expression of wary recognition. "I have heard of this but never experienced it. It is the place between two bonded wolves, the space where the truth lives." The landscape shifted, the grass rippled, and the sky darkened, and suddenly they were somewhere else. A bedroom, grand and cold and smelling of sickness. A man lay in the bed, gaunt and hollow-eyed, staring at the ceiling with the blank, focused intensity of someone who had already decided to stop living. A boy stood in the doorway, small, 9 years old, dark-haired, with gray eyes too large for his face and hands balled into fists at his sides. "Father," the boy's voice was thin and desperate. "Father, please look at me." The man in the bed did not move, did not blink, did not acknowledge the child in his doorway. Sable felt Theron go rigid beside her. She reached for his hand and found it clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "This is my memory," he said, his voice stripped bare. "This is what I see when I close my eyes." The scene shifted again. The same bedroom. Weeks later, the boy was gone. A healer stood by the bed, pulling a sheet over the man's face. And in the corridor outside, the boy sat alone on the cold stone floor, his back against the wall, his face empty of everything except the terrible understanding that he had not been enough to make his father want to live. "He did not die of the bond breaking," Theron whispered. "He died because he chose to. He stopped eating, stopped fighting, stopped looking at me." His voice fractured. "He chose her, even in death. He chose the memory of her over his living, breathing son, and I have spent every day since then making sure I would never be capable of doing that to anyone." Sable squeezed his hand so hard her fingers ached. The landscape shifted once more. The bedroom dissolved. The amber sky returned, and then changed again. And Sable found herself standing somewhere else entirely. A narrow street, early morning, cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays. Stone steps leading up to a wooden door with a healer's sign hanging above it. And on the steps, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, a baby, tiny, red-faced, wailing into the empty air. Sable's breath stopped. "No," she whispered. "I do not want to see this." But the bond space did not care what she wanted. It showed her what she needed. The street was quiet. The baby cried. Minutes passed. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the street, moving quickly, desperately. A woman, young, with wild dark hair and eyes that darted in every direction. She was injured, blood on her hands, on her dress, a deep cut across her collarbone that she was pressing closed with her palm. She reached the steps and fell to her knees beside the baby. She picked the child up, pressed her face against the tiny body, and sobbed. "I will come back for you," she whispered. "I swear it. I swear on everything I am. But they are coming, and if they find you with me." She placed the baby back on the steps. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the child. She pressed a ring, a small silver ring, into the blanket beside the baby's fist, and then she ran. Sable was crying. Tears streamed down her face in the bond space, and she could feel them on her physical body too. Feel the wetness soaking into the pillow in the real world where her body lay sleeping. "She came back," the bond space whispered, not in words, but in knowing. The young woman had come back 3 days later. The baby was gone, taken in by the healer, already passed along to another household. The woman searched. For years, she searched. She never found her daughter. "I was not abandoned," Sable breathed. I was hidden. She was protecting me. The ring, her mother's ring, the one she had carried in the bottom of her bag her entire life, the only thing she owned that predated her own memory. It had been a promise, not a goodbye. The bond space began to dissolve. The amber sky faded. The grass beneath her feet turned to warmth, to the feeling of blankets and the solid reality of the cottage floor and the presence of the man beside her. Sable and Theron woke at the same moment. They lay in the dark, breathing hard, tears on both their faces. The bond between them was alive, incandescent, humming with a frequency that vibrated through every nerve and bone and cell. Sable could feel his heartbeat as though it were her own, could feel his grief and his relief and his terrible aching hope. I was 9 years old. Theron said into the darkness, his voice rough and broken. And my father chose death over me, and I have spent my entire life making sure that love would never make me do the same thing to my child. He paused, his breathing hitched. But I did it anyway. I chose fear, and I lost my child all the same. Sable turned her head and looked at him. He was lying on the floor beside her bed, his face turned toward hers, close enough to touch. The moonlight through the cracked window painted his features in silver, and she could see the tears tracking down his temples into his hair. My mother did not leave me because I was not enough, Sable said quietly. She left me because she loved me too much to let them find me. The parallel settled between them like a bridge. Two people shaped by abandonment into opposite forms of the same wound. He had built walls to make sure he never needed anyone. She had built walls to make sure she never expected anyone to stay. And both of them had been wrong. I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to be in yours, Theron said. I will not ask you to trust me. I will not ask you to forgive me. I will show you, every day, that I am choosing you, choosing our child, choosing this. For as long as you will let me. Sable looked at him for a long time. The bond hummed between them, patient and warm and waiting. She did not say she forgave him. She was not ready for that, not yet, and she would not offer it as a gift he had not yet earned. But she reached down from the bed and found his hand in the dark. His fingers closed around hers immediately, fiercely, like a man gripping the only solid thing in a collapsing world. And the baby kicked. Both of them felt it. Not just the physical flutter in Sable's stomach, but something deeper, something that resonated through the bond like a bell struck in a cathedral. A third presence, small and bright and unmistakable. Their child's wolf, already alive, already aware, already reaching for both of them with a need so pure it made Sable gasp. She looked at Theron. He looked at her. And in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen there before. Not fear, not guilt, not the careful, controlled distance of a man protecting himself from his own heart. Hope. Fragile, terrified, newborn hope. Do not let go, she whispered. Never, he said. Not ever again. Something had changed. Sable felt it the moment she opened her eyes the next morning. The air in the room was different, lighter, as though a pressure she had been living under for so long she had forgotten it existed had finally, quietly, lifted. The bond between them was no longer a raw, bleeding thing straining against itself. It was warm, steady, present in a way that felt less like a chain and more like a hand held out in the dark. Theron was already awake. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Unguarded, open. The walls he had spent a lifetime building were down, and what remained was simply a man looking at the woman he loved with the terrified, trembling certainty that he did not deserve her but would spend every remaining breath trying to. Good morning, he said quietly. Good morning, she replied. Neither of them mentioned the bond space. Neither of them mentioned the tears or the revelations or the way their hands had stayed clasped through the rest of the night. But it was there, between them, a shared knowing that did not need words. The days that followed were different from the ones before. The distance remained, but the quality of it changed. It was no longer the cold, defended distance of two people protecting themselves from each other. It was the careful, deliberate space of two people learning to trust again, step by fragile step. Theron still worked, still kept his hands to himself and his words measured. But now, sometimes, Sable talked to him while he was busy, small things at first. the herbs she was drying. A funny thing Odessa had said. The way the baby had hiccuped at midnight and startled her awake. He listened the way he had always listened, with his full attention, his whole body oriented toward her even when his hands were busy. And she noticed, for the first time, that he had always done this. Even in the archive, even in those early months when she thought she was invisible, he had listened to her the way a man listens to music he cannot get out of his head. On the third day after the bond space, Draven came to the cottage with news that could not wait. The kingdom needs its king, the beta said. The council is fracturing. The northern territories are pressing their advantage. Border disputes are reopening. He paused. It will become a crisis soon if you do not return. Sable looked at Theron. He was watching her, not Draven, and the expression on his face was one she recognized. The look of a man being pulled between duty and desire, between the crown and the woman, between what the world demanded and what his heart required. But this time, he did not choose the crown. I am staying, Theron said. His voice was calm and absolute. If Sable wants me in Ashwick, then I am in Ashwick. If she wants me on the floor of a cottage for the rest of my life, then that is where I will be. I am done choosing the kingdom over the people I love. Sable stared at him. You would give up the throne, she said. Not a question. I would give up everything. His voice did not waver. I would abdicate tomorrow if that is what it takes for you to believe that I am choosing you. Not because I am dying without you. Not because the bond demands it, but because you are the choice I should have made from the beginning, and I will not get it wrong again. The words hung in the garden air, mingling with the scent of lavender and wood smoke and the distant sound of the river. Sable felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of it. Because this was not a man saying he was sorry. This was a man choosing differently. His father had chosen death over his living child. Theron was choosing his family over his crown. And that, Sable realized, was the bravest thing she had ever seen. She crossed the garden. He watched her approach with the stillness of a man who did not dare to hope. She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch, and looked up into the gray eyes she had fallen in love with in a dusty archive a lifetime ago. I do not want you to give up your kingdom, she said. Sable, I want you to come back to it, with me. Her voice shook, but her gaze was steady. I want our child to know their father. Not as a man who gave everything up, but as a man who learned to hold it all, the crown and the family, the kingdom and the love. She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it hammering beneath her palm, fast and desperate and alive. I am terrified, she admitted. I am terrified that I will walk back into that castle and be invisible again. That I will stand in doorways and wait to be noticed, and teach our child that love is something you earn by being useful. You will never stand in a doorway again, Theron said, and his voice broke on the promise. You will walk through every door beside me, in front of me, with my hand in yours and every wolf in the kingdom watching. I will make sure they see you, Sable. I will make sure everyone sees you. She kissed him. She rose up on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, and the bond between them detonated. It roared through her veins like wildfire, like sunlight, like every morning she had ever watched through a cracked window compressed into a single, blinding moment. His hands came up to cradle her face, gentle and trembling and reverent, and when he kissed her back, it was with the desperate tenderness of a man drinking water after years in the desert. I love you, he said against her lips. I have loved you since the night you knocked a stack of border ledgers onto the floor and apologized to the documents. Sable laughed. The sound burst out of her, sudden and bright and full of something she had almost forgotten existed. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated, terrifying joy. I love you too, she whispered. I have loved you since you laughed at me for it. He pulled her close, his arms wrapped around her, careful of the swell of their child between them, and she pressed her face against his chest and breathed him in and felt the bond settle into her bones like it had always been there, like it had been waiting for this moment her entire life. That night, in the narrow room at the back of Odessa's cottage, they completed the bond. It was not rushed or desperate. It was slow, tender, reverent. He held her like she was sacred, like every moment beside her was a gift he intended to earn for the rest of his life. She held his face in her hands and watched his eyes and saw in them a devotion so complete it made her chest ache. When he pressed his lips to the curve of her neck and claimed the mating mark, the ancient seal that bound a wolf bond for life, Sable felt the world crack open and reassemble itself into something new, something whole. The bond locked into place with a resonance that vibrated through both of them, through the child, through the walls of the cottage and the garden beyond, and the mountains rising silent against the stars. She claimed him back, marked him as hers, felt the bond flare brilliant and complete, two halves of the same whole finally joined. They held each other afterward, his hand resting on her stomach, the baby moving in slow, peaceful waves beneath his palm. The bond hummed between them, golden and warm and unbreakable. "Come home with me," he murmured against her hair. "Yes," she said. They left Ashwick on a clear morning. Sable hugged Odessa so tightly the healer had to pat her back and remind her that breathing was still required. "You saved my life," Sable told her. "You saved your own life, child. I just provided the tea." The ride north took 5 days. Theron insisted on a gentle pace, stopping whenever Sable needed rest. The castle appeared on the horizon on the fifth evening, its towers catching the last gold of the sunset. Sable's hand tightened on the reins. Theron reached over and took her hand. "Together," he said. They rode through the gates side by side. The guards saw them first, then the servants. Then the whispers began, spreading through the castle like wildfire. The king had returned, and beside him rode a woman, visibly carrying his child, wearing his mating mark on her throat. Theron dismounted and helped Sable down. He took her hand and walked her to the great hall. The doors stood open, the same doors she had stood in months ago, unseen and heartbroken, watching a future that had erased her. This time, every eye in the hall turned to watch her enter. This time, the king held her hand. This time, the entire kingdom saw her. Their daughter was born on a stormy night in late autumn, while the wind howled against the castle walls and the fire roared in the hearth of the king's chambers. Theron held Sable's hand through every moment of it, his face white with terror, his grip steady. When the baby's first cry pierced the air, he made a sound that was part laugh, part sob, and entirely unlike anything a fearsome Alpha King was supposed to produce. They named her Lumi. It meant light. The court adjusted slowly, as courts do. A foundling scribe as the Alpha Queen was not what anyone had envisioned, and the whispers followed Sable through the corridors for months. But Theron had meant what he said. She did not stand in doorways. She walked through them, beside him, with his hand in hers and the quiet, fierce certainty of a woman who had finally stopped waiting to be chosen because she already was. Odessa moved to the castle at Theron's insistence and took over as head healer. She reorganized the infirmary within a week and reduced 3 senior healers to tears with her efficiency. She was magnificent. Draven remained the beta. He spoiled Lumi shamelessly and denied it every time. The Northern Alliance was restructured without a mating union. Lysara Blackmere married an alpha from the coastal territories 6 months later. By all accounts, he adored her. Sable sent a gift and a note. Lysara sent one back. It contained a single line that made Sable laugh, and Theron wince. The bond between them grew stronger with time. Not in the dramatic, earth-shaking way of the stories, but in the quiet, daily way of two people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and their scars showing. He brought her tea every morning. She told him stories every night. He still listened with his whole body. She still caught him watching her across crowded rooms with an expression of such transparent, helpless adoration that the court had simply stopped pretending not to notice. On a quiet evening, months after Lumi's birth, Sable stood at the window of their chambers and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The baby slept in her cradle. Theron came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on the top of her head. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She leaned back into him. She could feel his heartbeat against her shoulder blade, steady and strong. She could feel the bond between them, warm and golden and permanent, and their daughter's small, bright presence glowing like a candle in the next room. I am thinking that I ran to tell you something once, she said, and I never got the chance. He pressed his lips to her temple. Tell me now. Sable smiled. Not the kind that cost everything. The kind that cost nothing at all because there was nothing left to guard. We are going to be all right, she said. And they were.